Hey, nerds. So, going to continue my series on Slavoj Zizek's book, Less Than Nothing. Of course, I've talked about him a lot. Hegelian slash Lacanian slash Marxist philosopher. He kind of talks like this and so on. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so he's going to get into some complex philosophy here that I'll explain. So, of course, he talks about Hegel a lot because he's a Hegelian, and he was the famous forget what century it was from. I'm going to double check that here. But he was, of course, very influential German idealist philosopher in continental philosophy. And of course, Hegel talks, yeah, Zizek, as I said, mentions Hegel a lot. And he also mentions Kant, who we'll get into, and Lacan. So remember, he's he's a Lacanian, but he's not a Kantian, and sometimes he agrees with Kant, but not always. So, but anyway, so yeah, Hegel was a German idealist, and he was very influential in it, and he wrote the Phenomenology of Spirit, of course, which is notoriously difficult to understand, but I think I have a slightly better understanding of it than I used to. And he talked about metaphysics a lot too, and language, and he gets into language and knowledge and reality and other very complex subjects in here, of course. And like I mentioned, Lacan is, as I always mention, Hegel's one of Hegel's major influences, 20th century psychoanalyst, and he came after Freud, but he was one of the early psychoanalysts like that, right? And a lot of people know about Kant. He was the one of the most influential philosophers of all time, and like phenomenally influential Enlightenment philosopher. So he talked a lot about epistemology, ethics, metaphysics, and various other subjects, of course. And we're going to get into his ideas of a priori knowledge. And all right, so with all that little bit of relevant context in mind here, we'll get into Zizek's paragraph in the book here. Okay, so he's using an analogy to Caesar here, of course, famous ancient Roman general. So when everyone knows about when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, right? No one had done that before, and he took that as a shortcut to completely surprise the enemy, which was historically seminal event because no one else had done that before, and then he destroyed the opposing army, right? So when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, his previous life appeared in a new way as a preparation for his later world historical role. So, in terms of time and like symbolic time, almost really, and in relation to knowledge too, in this paragraph, he's saying in terms of when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he he passed into a different time because this was like the present is between the future and the past, of course. But as you change, as you go through those different parts of time, the past, the present, and the future, your historical role changes places, right? Which makes sense, especially if you're very powerful and influential leaders like Caesar was, right? So he transformed into his world historical role as this great military leader at that point, according to basically Zizek is commenting on Hegel's opinion about this. So when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, his previous life appeared in a new way as a preparation for his later world historical role. That is, it was transformed into part of a totally different story. So basically, Hegel is separating the past, the present, and the future into three different stories. And in each of these different stories, we have different historical roles. That makes sense, right? So this is what Hegel calls totality, or what structuralism calls synchronic structure. So basically, the totality, the totality is your different historical roles in your different stories throughout time. That's the synchronic structure or the totality of time. And remember, structuralism, I've talked about post structuralism before, like my favorite 70s pervert post-structuralist philosopher Foucault, and my second favorite one, Derrida, and of course Jordan Peterson, the famous former clinical psychologist and pseudo-intellectual crackpot. He strawmans them all the time. But basically, as many people know, post-structuralism is in opposition to structuralism. So structuralism, basically, to oversimplify, uh, defends the modern Enlightenment institutions like government, science, and religion. And Foucault, in particular, but also Derrida, heavily criticized these ideas and deconstruct them rhetorically and in writing. They're not trying to destroy Western society. No, they're just doing an intellectual exercise. Anyway, so this is what Hegel calls totality, or what structuralism calls synchronic structure, a historical moment which is not limited to the present but includes its own past and future. So when we're in our different roles in the different stories throughout time, that become that becomes its own past, present, and future. So in each present moment, there becomes a new past, present, and future. And not only do we play different roles in different stories, it also changes symbolically. Not literal Well, you could say literally changes time and symbolically too. So this historical moment is not limited to the present, but includes its own past and future. In other words, the way the past and future appeared to and from this moment. So the way we look at the past, present, and future changes as we move forward in the future, obviously, right? And then we look at the past and see ourselves as having different historical roles in different stories. Same with the present, same with the future. You could say that's kind of a way to oversimplify it, but symbolically speaking, in terms of time, that makes sense, I would say. The way the past and the future appear to from this moment. So, the main implication of conceiving the symbolic order as such a totality is that, far from reducing it to a kind of transcendental a priori, so not just an a priori, so transcendental a priori. So, if we're talking about foundationalism in terms of knowledge, then Kant was very well known, of course, much later than Descartes. But Descartes was talking about a priori knowledge versus a posteriori knowledge. A posteriori knowledge is knowledge which you need to justify with arguments. And to oversimplify, Kant separated this out into, I think it was synthetic and logical, um, a priori true statements, I would say. So a priori ones, especially synthetic a priori truth claims, are ones that you assume don't need to be justified with argument and are just taken to be assumed to be true as a given. So he's combining this and saying that it's not just knowledge that doesn't have to be philosophically justified. It's transcendental. So remember, when I've talked about what transcendental means in terms of Kant before, when various philosophers have brought Kant up, it's that it's kind of like, to oversimplify, it's kind of more transcendent than transcendent. So it's definitely not always to do with God, but like in this example, basically, he's talking about transcendental knowledge. So basically, if we're talking about transcendent knowledge or transcendent God, transcendent knowledge is knowledge that is like above human perception, but it's still theoretically accessible. Like it exists on a different plane, but we can theoretically, metaphysically connect with it in some way, you could say. But transcendental is, like I said, to oversimplify, more transcendent than transcendent. So the difference between transcendent and transcendental is that they're both above human perception, but well, something, let's say, transcendent knowledge is above human perception, but theoretically accessible to us in some way or symbolically through metaphysics. Transcendental, since it's even more transcendent than transcendent, it's not just above human perception, it's completely outside of human perception. So it's this knowledge that's impossible for us to access, basically. So in terms of a transcendental a priori, this basically means an a priori that it has to be true. It's impossible for it not to be true. And because not only is it assumed to be true, it's transcendental, which means it's completely outside of human perception. So it would be impossible for us to philosophically justify it, even if we wanted to anyway. So basically, it's impossible for it to not be true. So this a transcendental a priori, to kind of oversimplify, is a knowledge claim that is just basically objectively true, you could say. That's probably the wrong word, but you could say it's objectively true. Okay, so in terms of a transcendental a priori, he describes it in a slightly different symbolic way here, basically. Transcendental a priori, a formal network given in advance which limits the scope of human practice. So basically, like I said, a knowledge claim which limits the scope of human practice. So it's completely impossible to transcend this a priori knowledge claim, because it limits this human practice the scope of this human practice is limited by this transcendental a priori claim. You could say you could say that's kind of a tautology, but it kind of makes sense, or at least if not, it's very interesting. So anyway, so the main implication of conceiving the symbolic order as such a totality is that, far from reducing it to a kind of transcendental a priori, a formal network given in advance which limits the scope of human practice, one should follow Lacan and focus. So he's saying in opposition to, well, rather than going with Kant's transcendental a priori, he's saying let's go with Lacan's idea about knowledge here instead. One should follow Lacan and focus on how the gestures of symbolization are entwined with and embedded in the process of collected practice. So symbolization is embedded in the collective. You could say that symbolization is embedded in the collective practice of what Hegel calls totality. So you could say that the collective practice of symbolization is the totality of knowledge. Very complex philosophical statement, but given all these building blocks, it makes sense if you think about it, right? So I'll say that again. The symbolization, you could say the symbolic order of the collected practice of the symbolic order is the totality of knowledge. So then you could deconstruct knowledge to being the symbolic order formed by the collective practice. So we as humans collectively together form the symbolic order, which forms the totality of our knowledge, if that makes sense. Okay. So one should follow Lacan and focus on how the gestures of symbolization are entwined with and embedded in the process of collective practice. What Lacan elaborates is the twofold moment of the symbolic function reaches far beyond the standard theory of the performative dimension of speech. So now he's connecting not just time to knowledge, but time to knowledge and language. So, twofold moment of the symbolic function reaches far behind the standard theory of the performative dimension of speech, as developed in the tradition from J.L. Austin to John Searle. So, I'm not familiar with J.L. Austin, but he's not really relevant to this paragraph. But John Searle was a famous 20th century rationalist and materialist in terms of consciousness and knowledge. So, basically, there's a lot of complexity here, right? So Slavoj Zizek is talking about Kant's transcendental knowledge, Hegel's totality or synchronic structure or symbolic order of knowledge, and how basically speech forms our collective practice as humans that we use to form the totality of the symbolic order of time. Yeah, that makes sense. So the way so as always, well, not always, as often happens with philosophers, countless times, especially with really intellectual, deep dive, complex ones like Slavoj Zizek and innumerable others, they have very complex, interesting ideas when you actually realize what they're talking about, but they're terrible writers, so they're bad at expressing their ideas and, like, simplifying them into an understandable point. So, again, in terms of this metaphor of Caesar and the symbolic order and our roles, our historical roles in different stories changing across time, this forms basically how we collectively change our roles across time, forms the totality of our knowledge. And we do this through speaking. Like we gain knowledge from speaking to each other, right? So again, to connect this all together in terms of Kant's transcendental a priori, Hegel's totality of knowledge, and Lacan's kind of psychoanalytical symbolic order in terms of speech, the way that you could say that Zizek connects these all together is this simple but complex statement, I would say. So that so basically the language, us talking, the collective practice of us using language to express our totality of the symbolic order of knowledge. So this is how we find knowledge through the collective practice of language forming the totality of the symbolic order of knowledge. So, this is how knowledge is formed in a nutshell. Through the collective practice of language, we express and form the totality of the symbolic order of knowledge. So basically, we're talking about knowledge, time, and language. So we collectively use our language across time to form the totality of transcendental knowledge. So we use our language collectively across time to express and arrive at the totality of the symbolic order of knowledge.